Good afternoon. This is the left bank. This is the part and the chapter, the Procurator of Judea. This is part 10. On the 5th of December 1947, the steamship Kim entered the port of Negevo with human cargo. Winter was coming on and navigation would soon be impossible, so this was the last ship that year. Magadan met its guests with 40 below weather. These, however, were no guests, but convicts, the true masters of this land. The whole city administration had come down to the port. Every truck in town was there to meet the boat. Soldiers, conscripts, and regulars surrounded the pier, and the process of unloading began. Responding to the summons of the telegraph, every truck not needed in the mines within a radius of 500 kilometers had arrived empty in Magadan. The dead were tossed on the shore to be hauled away to the cemetery and buried in mass graves without so much as identification tags. A directive was made up ordering that the bodies be exhumed at some later date. Patients who were moderately ill were taken to the central prison hospital on the left bank of the Kolyma River. The hospital had just been moved there, 500 kilometers away. If the Kim had arrived a year earlier, no one would have had to make the long trip to the new hospital. The head of surgery, Kolyma, had just been transferred from an army post. He had been on the front lines, but even so, he was shaken by the sight of these people, by their terrible wounds. Every truck arriving from Magadan carried the corpses of people who had died on the way to the hospital. The surgeon understood that these were the transportable minor cases, and that the more seriously ill had been left in the port. The surgeon kept repeating the words of General Radishev, which he had read somewhere just after the war. Experience on the front cannot prepare a man for the sight of death in the camps. Kubantsev was losing his composure. He didn't know what sort of orders to give, where to begin, but something had to be done. The orderlies were removing patients from the trucks and carrying them on stretchers to the surgical ward. Stretchers with patients were crammed into the corridors. Smells cling to the memory as if they were poems or human faces. That festering camp stench remained forever in Kubantsev's memory. He would never forget that smell. One might think that the smell of pus and death is the same everywhere. That's not true. Ever since that day, it always seemed to Kubantsev that he could smell his first Kolyma patients. Kubantsev smoked constantly, feeling he was losing control of himself, and he didn't know what instructions to give to the orderlies, the paramedics, the doctors. Alexei Alexeyevich, Kubantsev heard someone say his name. It was Brauda, the surgeon who had formerly been in charge of this ward, but who had been removed from his position by the higher-ups, simply because he was an ex-convict and had a German name to boot. Let me take over. I'm familiar with all this. I've been here for 10 years. Upset, Kubantsev relinquished his position of authority, and the work began. The surgeons began their operations simultaneously. The orderlies scrubbed down to assist. Other orderlies gave injections and poured out medicine for the patients. Amputations, only amputations, Brauda muttered. He loved surgery and even admitted to suffering when a day in his life went by without an operation, without a single incision. We won't be bored this time, Brauda thought happily. Kubantsev isn't a bad sort, but he was overwhelmed by all of this. A surgeon from the front. They've got all their instructions, plans, orders, but this is life itself, Kolyma. In spite of all this, Brad was not a vicious person. Demoted for no reason, he did not hate his successor nor try to trip him up. On the contrary, Brod could see Kubantsev's confusion and sense his deep gratitude. After all, the man had a family, a wife, a boy in school. The officers all got special rations, lofty positions, hardship pay. As for Brod, he had only a 10-year sentence behind him and a very dubious future. Brod was from Saratov, a former student of the famous Krauss, and had shown so much promise at one time. But the year 1937 shattered Brod's life. Why should he attempt to take revenge on Kubantsev for his own failures? And Brod commanded Kut's war. Brod lived forgetting himself, and even though he hated this forgetfulness in moments of contemplation, he couldn't change. He had decided today to leave the hospital to go to the mainland. The fairy tale seemed to be over, but we don't know even the beginning. On the 5th of December 1947, the steamship Kim entered the port of Negevo with human cargo, 3,000 convicts. During the trip, the convicts had mutinied, and the ship authorities had decided to hose down all the holds. This was done when the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. Kubantsev had come to Kolyma to speed up his pension. And on the first day of his Kolyma service, he learned what third and fourth degree frostbite were. All this had to be forgotten, and Kubantsev, being a disciplined man with a strong will, did precisely that. He forced himself to forget. 17 years later, Kubantsev remembered the names of each of the convict orderlies. He remembered all the camp romances and which of the convicts lived with whom. He remembered the rank of every heartless administrator. There was only one thing that Kubantsev didn't remember: the steamship Kim with its 3,000 prisoners. Anatoly France has a story. The Procurator of Judea. In it, after 17 years, Pontius Pilate cannot remember Christ. The Lepers. Immediately after the war, a drama was played out at the hospital, or to be more precise, it was the conclusion of a drama. The war had dragged out into the light of day whole strata of life that always and everywhere remain at the bottom. The actors were not criminals or underground political groups. In the course of military actions, the leprosaria had been destroyed, and the patients had merged with the rest of the population. Was this a secret war or an open one? Was it chemical or bacteriological? People ill with leprosy easily passed themselves off as wounded or maimed in war. Lepers mixed with those fleeing to the east and returned to a real, albeit terrible life where they were accepted victims or even heroes of the war. These individuals lived and worked. The war had to end in order for the doctors to remember about them and for the terrible card catalogs of the leprosaria to fill up again. Lepers lived among ordinary people, sharing the retreat and the advance, the joy and the bitterness of victory. They worked in factories and on farms. They got jobs and even became supervisors, but they never became soldiers. The stubs of the fingers that appeared to have been damaged in the war prevented them from assuming this last occupation. Lepers passed themselves off as war invalids and were lost in the throng. Sergei Fedorenko was a warehouse manager, a war invalid. He was sufficiently able to to command the disobedient stumps of his fingers to do his job well. He was forging a career for himself and expected to become a member of the party. But when he got too close to money, he arrived. Sorry, I got itchy. Sorry. He was forging a career for himself and expected to become a member of the party, but when he got too close to money, he began to drink and run around with women and got arrested. He arrived in Magadan on one of the Kolyma ships as a common criminal with a sentence of 10 years. Here Fedorenko switched his diagnosis. Although there were more than enough persons maimed either by war or by their own hand, it was more advantageous, more fashionable, and less noticeable to dissolve in the sea of frostbite cases. That was how I met him in the hospital, with supposedly 3rd to 4th degree frostbite, a wound that wouldn't heal, 1 foot and the fingers of both hands reduced to stumps. It's really hard to think about them because I know exactly what they're going through, what they went through. I know exactly what that feels like. Fedorenko was undergoing treatment without any results, but then every patient tried his utmost to resist treatment so as not to go back to the mines. After many months of trophic ulcers, Fedorenko was released from the hospital. Not wanting to leave, he became an orderly and was ultimately promoted to senior orderly in the surgical ward with 300 beds. This was the central hospital with 1,000 convict prisoners. 1 floor of 1 wing was reserved for civilian employees. Somehow it happened that the doctor who was normally in charge of Fedorenko's case fell ill, and Dr. Krasinski, an old military doctor and a lover of Jules Verne, was handling his patients for him. Kolyma life had not yet beaten out of him the desire to chat, gossip, and discuss cases. In examining Fedorenko, Krasinski experienced a feeling of surprise, but he couldn't put his finger on just what it was. He had known this feeling of anxiety from time to time ever since he was a student. No, this was not a trophic ulcer, not a stub left by an explosion or an axe. The flesh was slowly decomposing. Krasinski's heart began to beat. He called Fedorenko over to the window, to the light, and greedily peered into his face, unable to believe what he saw. It was leprosy, a line from the medical school. Text ran through Krasinski's mind. The human face begins to resemble that of a lion, and Fedorenko's face was a lion's mask. Feverishly, Krasinski leafed through his textbooks, took a large needle and poked one of the numerous white spots on Fedorenko's skin several times. There was no sensation of pain. Sweating, Krasinski wrote a report to his superiors. The patient, Fedorenko, was isolated in a separate room, and samples of his skin were sent for biopsies to Magadan, and from there to Moscow. The response came in about 2 weeks. Leprosy. It was as if Krasinski were celebrating his birthday. The hospital authorities wrote to still higher authorities about sending Fedorenko to the Kolyma leprosarium, which was situated on an island with machine guns trained on the crossing. There was a guard. There had to be a guard. Fedorenko did not deny that he had been in a leprosarium and that the patients, left to their own devices, had fled to freedom, just as in an ordinary life. Some followed the retreating army, and others went forward to meet the Germans. Fedorenko calmly began to wait to be sent off, but the hospital was in an uproar. People were shouting and cursing Fedorenko. Everyone feared leprosy, even those who had been beaten during questioning and whose souls had been ground into dust by 1,000 interrogations, whose bodies were broken and tormented by unbearable labor. whose sentences of 25 years hard labor capped with 5 years exile, sentences they could never serve or survive. The same psychic phenomenon was at work that forced a man to postpone a well-planned escape simply because there would be tobacco or commissary privileges that day. There was this strange and illogical instances as there are in camps. Human shame, for example, how does one measure it? What are its limits? People whose lives are ruined, whose past and future have been trampled on, suddenly find themselves in the grip of some trivial prejudice, some nonsense that they for some reason can neither ignore nor deny. And the sudden appearance of shame is the most subtle of human emotions, to be remembered for one's entire life as something real and infinitely precious. There was an incident in the hospital when an orderly, who was not yet an orderly and was simply helping out, was assigned to shave a newly arrived group of women. The administration was amusing itself by assigning men to shave women and women to shave men. But this man begged his superior to classify the affair as sanitary treatment. He just could not accept that his life was ruined, that these amusements of the camp authorities were nothing but a dirty foam in the terrible kettle where he himself was being boiled away. Well, this amusing, tender human streak reveals itself suddenly. The hospital was in a panic. After all, Fedorenko had been working there for several months. Unfortunately, the prodromal period of the illness, which precedes the appearance of any external symptoms, can last for several years. Those inclined to suspect the worst are doomed to retain their fear in their souls forever, whether they were civilian or employees or convicts. The hospital was in a panic. The doctors searched their own bodies and those of their patients for white, insensitive spots. A needle joined the phonendoscope and small rubber hammer as a standard equipment for any doctor conducting a preliminary examination. The patient, Fedorenko, was brought before the orderlies and doctors and undressed. An overseer with a pistol stood near the patient. Dr. Krasinski, armed with an enormous pointer, gave a lecture on leprosy, pointing his stick alternately at the leonine face of the former orderly, at the fingers that were on the verge of falling off, and at the shiny white spots on his back. All residents, without exception, civilian and convict, were re-examined, and suddenly a white spot insensitive to pain was discovered on the back of Shura Leshinskaya, a nurse from the front lines on duty in the women's ward. Leshinskaya, who had been in the hospital for only a few months, had no lion's mask. Her conduct had been neither stricter nor looser than that of any nurse recruited from among the former prisoners. Leshinskaya was locked up in one of the rooms of the women's ward, and a sample of her skin was sent to Magadan and from there to Moscow for analysis. The answer came: leprosy. Disinfection after leprosy is quite difficult. Regulations require that the house in which the leper has lived be burned. That was what the textbook said, but how could one of the wings of a gigantic 2-story hospital be burned? No one could make up his mind to do that. It was something like disinfecting expensive furs. To preserve the value of their furs, the owners are willing to risk leaving the infection in them. They sprinkle some chemical symbolically on the precious furs, because steaming would destroy not only the microbes but the fur as well. The administration would have remained silent even if it had been a matter of the plague or cholera. Someone assumed responsibility for not burning the wing and even the room in which Fedorenko was kept under lock and key was not burned. They simply soaked everything with phenol and carbolic acid and sprayed repeatedly. Downstairs in the basement, 2 tiny rooms were constructed for the patients. Fedorenko and Lashinskaya were transferred there. Guards were stationed beside the heavy padlocked doors, and the couple was left there to await an order or a detachment of guards from the Lepers. Fedorenko and Lashinskaya spent one day in their cells, and when the guards were changed at the end of the day, the cells were both found empty. Panic ensued in the hospital. Every window and door in the cells was intact. Krasinski was the first to figure out how they had fled. They had escaped through the floor. Fedorenko had used his enormous strength to pry the logs apart and had broken into the bread-slicing room and an operating room of the surgical ward. They had gathered up all the grain alcohol and the narcotics from the cupboards and made off with their loot to an underground den. They had selected a spot, barricaded it, and thrown blankets and mattresses on top of the wall themselves off, and to wall themselves off from the world, the guards, the hospital, and the Lepers. They lived there as man and wife for several days, 3 days, I believe. On the 3rd day, guards with dogs found the 2 lepers. I was a member of the group that searched the tall basement of the hospital. The foundation was very high at that spot. The guards removed the logs and exposed the 2 lepers lying naked. They didn't get up. Fedorenko's dark, mutilated hands were around Lashinskaya's gleaming body. Both were drunk. They were covered with blankets and carried away to one of the 2 cells no longer separated. Who covered them with a blanket? Who touched their terrible bodies? A special janitor was found in the civilian hospital and, with the permission of higher authorities, given a credit of 7 working days for each one he spent with the lepers. This was more than they give people for working in the tungsten mines, the lead mines, or the uranium mines. 7 days for one. The article of the penal code under which the man was sentenced was not taken into consideration. They found a soldier arrested at the front and sentenced to 25 years hard labor and 5 years of exile, who naively assumed that his heroism would shorten his sentence and bring near the day of his liberation. Convict Korolkov, a wartime lieutenant, stood guard at the cell round the clock. He even slept before the door. And when the guards arrived from the island on which the leprosarium was located, convict Korolkov was taken with the 2 lepers to tend to their needs. I never heard anything more of Korolkov or of Fedorenko or of Lashinskaya. Oh, you know what happened to them. Descendant of a Decembrist. The Decembrists were a group of Russian officers who unsuccessfully attempted to stage a coup in December 1825. Most were exiled to Siberia, accompanied by their wives. Many books have been written about Mikhail Lunin, the first Hussar and a famous Decembrist. In the destroyed chapter of Eugene Onegin, Pushkin wrote, "Friend of Mars, Bacchus, and Venus." He was a true knight, an intelligent, well-informed man who not only spoke up for his cause but worked actively towards it. It was indeed a great cause. In due course, I will tell you everything I know about the second Hussar, his descendant. Hungry and exhausted, we leaned into a horse collar raising blood blisters on our chests and pulling stone-filled cart up the slanted mine door. The collar was the same device used long ago by the ancient Egyptians. I saw it, experienced it myself. Throughout Kolyma, the mine was notorious. The cool, snowless Kolyma winter of 1940-41 was approaching. Cold crushed the muscles and squeezed a man's temples. Iron stoves were placed in the tarpaulin tents that served as our shelter in the summer months, but the tents, a mass of holes, could not retain the free air. Our inventive bosses were preparing people for the winter. Inside each tent, a second, smaller frame was constructed that was designed to trap a layer of air about 4 inches thick. This frame was covered, all but the ceiling, with roofing material. The resulting double tent was slightly warmer than the single canvas one. The first night spent in these tents made it clear that this arrangement meant doom, and a quick doom at that. I had to get out of there, but how? Who would help? 5 miles from us was a large camp at Arkagala, where miners worked. Our group was considered a part of that camp. I had to get transferred there, to Arkagala. But how? Convict tradition demands that in such instances a prisoner first of all approach a doctor. There was a first aid station at Kadichkan, run by a former student of a Moscow medical institute who hadn't finished his course of study. At least that was the rumor in our tent. It required enormous willpower to find the strength to go to the first aid station. I didn't have to get dressed or put on my boots, of course, since I wore them constantly from one bathhouse day to the next. But I just didn't have the strength. Why should I waste my rest period on this visit to the doctor when it might result only in mockery or even a beating? Such things happen. But the main consideration was the hopelessness, the slimness of a chance of success. Nevertheless, I couldn't afford to lose even the slightest chance in the search for luck. This judgment came from my body and its exhausted muscles, not from experience or intelligence. As in beasts, the will will subordinate to instinct. On the other side of the road from our tent was a small hut used by geologists, exploring parties, secret police, and military patrols. The geologists had left long ago, and the hut had been converted into an outpatient medical facility with a cot, a cupboard with medications, a curtain made from an old blanket. The blanket concealed the area where the doctor lived. Right down the middle of the road was a line of people queuing up in the bitter cold to be examined. I squeezed my way into the hut, and the heavy door, closing behind me, pushed me right in. The doctor had blue eyes, a large forehead with 2 bald spots, and hair. He had to have hair. Hair was an existential statement. Hair in camp is a testimony to importance. Almost everyone was shaved bald, so that anyone who had hair was the object of general envy. Combed hair was a particular form of protest against life in the camp. From Moscow, a doctor asked me, from Moscow, let's get acquainted. I gave him my name and shook his outstretched hand. It was cold and somewhat moist. Lunin. That's a proud name, I said with a smile. I'm his great-grandson. In our family, the oldest son is always called either Mikhail or Sergei. We alternate. Pushkin's Lunin was Mikhail Sergeyevich. I know somehow this, our first discussion, didn't smack at all of the camps. I forgot about my request, since I didn't want to introduce an inappropriate note into our conversation. Have a smoke? I began to roll a cigarette with my rosy, frostbitten fingers. Take more, don't be bashful. Back at home I have a whole library of books about my great-grandfather. I am a medical student, but I was arrested and didn't graduate. Everyone in our family was in the military except me. I became a doctor, and I don't regret it. So much from Mars, a friend of Asclepius Bacchus in Venus. Boy, I mutilated that. I don't know about the Venus part, but it certainly is true about Asclepius. Except I don't have a diploma. If I did, I'd really show them. How about Bacchus? Well, of course, I do not have a grain alcohol here, but all I need is one shot glass. I get drunk easily. But you know how things are. I take care of the civilian village as well. Come back again sometime. On the point of leaving, I open the door slightly with my shoulder. You know, Lunan said, Muscovites like to talk about their town, the streets, the skating rinks, the houses, the Moscow River, more than Kievan's or the Leningraders do. You people like to talk about the city even more, and they remember it better. I dropped by several times in the evening when Lunan had finished attending to patients. I'd smoke a homemade cigarette, but never got up the nerve to ask for bread. Sergei Mikhailovich, like everyone who either through luck or profession had an easy time of it in camp, didn't think much about others and couldn't really understand hungry people. His sector, Arkagala, was getting enough to eat, and the mine catastrophes had bypassed the town. If you like, I'll operate on you. Remove that cyst from your finger. All right. Just don't ask me to release you from work. You know yourself. It's not really convenient for me to do that. But how can I work with my finger all cut up? You'll manage. I agreed, and Lunan did a good job of removing the cyst and gave it to me as a keepsake. Many years later, my wife and I were to meet, and the first minute of our meeting, she squeezed my fingers, feeling in amazement for that cyst. I realized that Sergei Mikhailovich was simply very young, that he needed an educated person to talk to, that his views of the camps and his idea of the fate were no different from those of any civilian supervisor, that he was even capable of admiring the camp thugs, and that the brunt of the storm of 38 had passed over him. I treasured every day, every hour of rest, exhausted from the life in the gold mines. My muscles demanded a respite. I treasured every piece of bread, every bowl of soup. My stomach demanded food, and my will was not strong enough to keep my eyes from wandering over the shelves in search of bread. But I forced myself to remember Moscow's Chinatown, which has no Chinese, and the Nikitsky Gates, where the writer Andrei Slovo shot himself, and where Stern shot at the German ambassador's car. It is that part of Moscow's street history which will never be written down. Yes, Moscow, Moscow. Tell me, how many women have you had? It was senseless for a half-starved man to keep up this conversation, but the young surgeon listened only to himself and wasn't offended by my silence. Sergei Mikhailovich, our fates are a crime, the greatest crime of the age. I'm not sure of that, Sergei Mikhailovich said to me with an expression of displeasure. It's just the people muddying the water. I shrugged my shoulders. Soon Sergei Mikhailovich got his transfer to Archigala, and I thought, without any sadness or feeling of injustice, that one more person had left my life forever, and that parting was, in reality, an easy thing. But matters worked out differently. The supervisor of the sector where we worked, harnessed to an Egyptian yoke-like slave, was Pavel Ivanovich Kislyak, a middle-aged engineer. He was not a party member. He beat his prisoners daily. Whenever the supervisor set foot in the sector, there were beatings, blows, and shouting. Was it because he had no fear of being punished? Was there a bloodlust lurking in the depths of his soul, or perhaps a desire to distinguish himself in the eyes of the senior superpowers? Power is a terrible thing. Fugarov, a counterfeiter from my work gang, lay in the snow, spitting out his broken teeth. All my relatives were shot for counterfeiting, but I was a minor, so I got off with only 15 years hard labor. My father offered the prosecutor 500,000 rubles, real ones, in cash, but he wouldn't go for it. There were 4 of us working the shift, harnessed to the horse collar and walking around the post. We stopped near Zelfugarov. There was Korneyev, a Siberian peasant, Leonya Semyonov, a thief, the engineer Vronsky, and myself, Semyonov, said, "It's only in camp that you learn to work with machinery. Try your hand at any kind of work. What do you care if you break a crane or a winch?" This point of view was popular even among many of the young surgeons in Kolyma. Vronsky and Korneyev were my acquaintances. We were not friends, but we had known each other since we had been together at Black Lake, an assignment where I returned to life. Without getting up, Zelfugarov turned his bloodied face with his swollen, dirty lips to us. "I can't get up, guys." He hit me under the ribs. "Go tell the paramedic. I'm afraid to. That will only make things worse. You'll tell the supervisor." "Listen," I said, "there's no end to this. We have only one way out. As soon as the coal production chief or some other bigwig comes, someone must step forward and hit Kiselyov right on the snout. People will talk about it all over Kolyma, and they'll have to transfer Kiselyov. Whoever hits him will have his sentence lengthened. How many years will they give you for him?" We returned to our work, leaned into the horse collar, went back to the barracks, had supper, and prepared to go to sleep. The office sent for me. Kiselyov was sitting in the office, staring at the floor. He was no coward and didn't fear threats. "So that's it," he said cheerfully. "All Kolyma will talk about it. I could have you put on trial for an attempt on my life. Get out of here, you bastard." The only one who could have turned me in was Vronsky, but how? We were together the entire time. After that, life at the work site became easier for me. Kiselyov didn't approach our work collar and came to work with a small caliber rifle. He didn't descend into the test pit either. Someone entered the barracks. "The doctor wants to see you." The doctor who replaced Lunin was a certain Kolensnikov, a tall young student who had also been arrested and thus had never finished his course of study. When I arrived, I found Lunin sitting at the table in his overcoat. "Get your things ready. We're leaving for Archigala." Kolesnikov made up a transfer sheet. Kolesnikov folded a piece of paper several times and tore off a tiny fragment that was hardly larger than a postage stamp. He wrote on it in microscopic handwriting, "Transferred to medical section, Arkagala." Lunin took the paper and ran off. "I'll have Selyov issue a travel permit. He was upset when he returned. He won't let you go. He says you threatened to hit him in the face, and he absolutely refuses to agree." I told Lunin the story. "It's your fault," he said. "Why do you care about Zelfugorov after all these? They weren't beating you. I was beaten before. While I'm off, the truck is leaving. We'll think of something," and Lunin got into the cab. A few days passed and Lunin appeared again. "I'm here to see Kiselyov. About you. You returned in half-hour." "Everything's in order," he agreed. "How?" "I have a method of taming the heart of the rebellious," and Sergei Mikhailovich acted out the conversation with Kiselyov. "What brings you to these parts, Sergei Mikhailovich? Sit down and have a smoke." "Sorry, I don't have the time, Pavel Ivanovich. These petitions accusing you of beatings have been forwarded to me but before signing them, I decided to ask you if they were accurate." "It's a lie, Sergei Mikhailovich. My enemies will say anything." "That's what I thought. I won't sign them. What difference would it make, Pavel Ivanovich? What's done is done, and there's no replacing teeth that have been knocked out." Sorry, I'm running out of recording room, so I'm gonna have to stop right here, and I'll pick that up as soon as I can. I'll come back to it. Thank you for listening.